Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. And welcome to this learning experience brought to you by AWS and Aqua Security. My name is Cody, and welcome back to Techstrong Learning, where we have another exciting presentation for you. Before we get things started, I do have just a couple of housekeeping notes I'd like to review. First off, today's session is being recorded. So if you miss any of our discussion, perhaps you'd like to rewatch at a later time or share with your team, you will be receiving an email with a link to access the link on demand shortly after we conclude our live recording. Now, if you'd like to engage with us, there are a couple of options for you to do so. The first option is to use the chat tab on the right side of your screen. We do have a global audience, so we want everybody to go ahead and use that chat feature to let us know from where in the world you are tuning in. Now, if you have any specific questions, we want you to send those into the Q&A tab. Sending those questions to the Q&A just helps us keep track, and we want to answer as many of your questions as we can today. Additionally, if you check out the handout section, you'll see we have a couple of resources there for you. And of course, before we close things out today, we are giving away 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So be sure to stick around for the duration of today's program. So our topic is Secure Your Financial Data in the Cloud, Empowering Financial Services Organizations with CSPM. And I'm joined today by Tsvi Korren, Field CTO at Aqua Security, and Peter Williams, Head of Partner Technology and Global Financial Services at AWS. So Tsvi, Peter, thank you so much for joining us today. Tsvi, would you like to go ahead and get us started?
So again, my name is Tsvi. I'm the Field CTO at Aqua Security. And I have Peter with me from AWS. Why don't you do a quick introduction of yourself, Peter?
Absolutely. Thanks, V. I'm Peter Williams. I lead the AWS Financial Services Partner Architecture team. So thanks so much for having me.
All right. And the topic of the discussion that we're going to do today between Peter, myself, and everybody else here is about securing of financial data in the cloud and how really financial services organizations specifically can empower themselves and their application and their business to take advantage of working in the public cloud, consuming cloud, and doing it safely and securely. So for the sake of time, let's jump right ahead here. And you know, when we talk about adoption of cloud in general, adoption of cloud in certain verticals, there is always this tension between the people that want to run applications, take advantage of newer technology, improve service, do it quickly and produce a lot of innovation. And the more conservative side, especially in financial services, where really, you know, our customers, your customers in banking and so on, really rely on the fact that you guarantee their privacy, guarantee their money, by impact that, guarantee their lives, and create trust between the parties. So traditionally, you know, financial services have been very focused on security, and rightfully so. And we find ourselves today where there is a push to put things in the public cloud, deploy applications and workloads in the cloud, and just take advantage of the cloud. But financial services have been a laggard at that. And I think, you know, I've seen that from the security side, and I'm sure, Peter, you've seen that from the AWS side. So what was your experience with financial services specifically adopting the public cloud as a way to run their business?
Yeah, good question, Tsvi. I think I've been at Amazon about 7 years now, and what's interesting to me is that evolution that you're referring to. And you know, back in 2016, when I joined, you know, we saw a lot of adoption at that time in financial services, primarily from hedge funds. There was some asset managers that were kind of playing with cloud. But a lot of the sell side firms and across capital markets and even in insurance were kind of just trying to understand the possibilities, and especially I would say at that time the question was, how can I be secure in the cloud? And the interesting thing was that as we started, you know, educating customers and working with them to solve for their specific regulatory requirements, where security is essential, and security really standards to meet those compliance requirements was essential. There were a lot of advances that were made. We actually early days worked very closely with certain leading banks to actually help them to do things like manage their own security using their own keys and services like KMS and a lot of other kind of innovations. But what primarily the evolution, I would say over the kind of the first 3 years I was here, this goes back in 2016 to 2019, I would say, was that understanding that security in the cloud enables you to track all activities in a way that is actually beyond what's possible in a data center. And specifically, I mean, the ability to track every API call, right? There's no ability to sort of walk over to a server and make a change, right? Everything that happens in the cloud is done through an API call. So any modification that occurs is actually trackable, right? And thanks to the effectively unlimited storage in the cloud, you can actually log every single thing that occurs, and then be able to run analytics against that and identify what changed. And so what our customers in financial services realized as we were working with them to help educate them was that actually they could get a lower level, a more complete picture of what has occurred in their environments in the cloud than they could in their data center. And so that was super exciting, because then they actually became, and today certainly organizations across financial services tell us, and we here commonly believe it's more secure in the cloud. The other thing that came up was around compliance. It was kind of a secondary phase. Once the security professionals started understanding this, the compliance professionals said, all right, wait a second, how am I going to report to my regulator? How am I going to prove that I'm compliant, right? Because that is a new environment they didn't understand. And it was, again, this ability to track literally everything that occurs, and to catalog that and log it and then report on it in a very systematic way, which is really not possible in a data center. That all of a sudden was transformational for them.
Yeah. So let's break that down a little bit, right? So we talked about two things, right? We talked about all the things that cloud can do for the business, providing scalable, immediate storage, providing specialty services, right? We all want, Alexa to be involved in our banking. We can run all sorts of workloads that maybe you don't have the expertise today. Cloud takes care of networking at scale and can provide things like databases and other backend applications. And those can be provisioned with APIs, which means that even if you don't know how to set up a massive SQL database or a set of storage, you can do that with very simple APIs into the cloud. And then another thing, Peter, that you mentioned was that the cloud can provide a lot of security services, right? It's self-documenting, right? So if you've ever struggled with a CMDB or the need to account for everything that you have in your data center, and you really didn't know who put out a server somewhere, the cloud takes care of that. We also have the redundancy, the recovery, the multi-region ability. And then what we talked about was the availability monitoring and anything that we can see around the change logs, the interaction, the API calls, and so on, all contribute to security. And the way that I think it's kind of nice to kind of look into what is really the difference between doing security in the cloud and security in the data center. I mean, the cloud itself is kind of like your data center itself, right? So who has access? I'm old enough to remember the day where we had cages where servers actually ran, and you had to sign in and out of them. And that's really kind of the envelope of the entire data center. On the other hand, the cloud also houses really your data, your infrastructure, your workload. And there is a model to understand what the boundaries are. So it's called the shared responsibility model. And that is providing us with really what are the boundaries that we need to understand when we provide our applications in the cloud. So what is really, in this case, AWS's responsibility, or what services AWS can respond, can be responsible for, and then what we need to do as consumer of the cloud to make sure that our application is running. So Peter, what is your experience? What is the best way for you to kind of explain that shared responsibility model?
Yeah, so really important understanding. The hardware and the data centers, regions, and all of the physical environments that exist in the cloud, right, are managed by AWS. And so protecting the data centers, enabling network connectivity to the internet and between availability zones and between regions, all of that is managed by AWS. And then, even things above that, as you see in the chart here, like compute and storage and accessibility of running a new server or accessing storage, all of those things at that layer of software are managed in AWS. But then everything that the customer wants to do in the cloud, right, that's kind of above that line. And so their ability to connect to the internet, right, that could create an internet gateway or not, and then how they allow traffic and how they manage the software that is running in the cloud, all of that and above is actually the customer's responsibility.
Yeah, and the rest of the hour, we're going to talk about really what you can do in the areas that are your responsibility and also your ability to affect change. Although I'm not totally convinced that we solved the apprehension problem. So let's kind of go back a little bit and break down some of the objections that I hear about what are the conditions to move into a cloud infrastructure specifically for financial services. And I think the hesitation really begins with the people. The cloud, if you're not familiar with it, if you haven't operated in a public cloud environment, can be a little scary. And the lack of cloud security expertise, in particular, is, I think, inhibiting the adoption of the cloud. The fact is, I think nowadays, people that come out of school or people that have done job training, nobody really knows how to install an operating system anymore, right? We're not in the days where you really had to install everything from scratch. I think there is actually a lot more talent in cloud operations today than there ever was. And it's really just a matter of finding those resources or even train the existing personnel in ops to start to look in cloud. And the transition is really not that bad. There is a lot of options to educate yourself, and AWS itself, provide a lot of education in that and can help you get started. I think when we go beyond that, beyond the initial apprehension, we really start to talk about the specifics. One is, if you look at the top right there, is the disappearing network boundaries, right? Because the public cloud is not really wrapped up. It's not behind your personal firewall. These are shared data centers, shared infrastructure, and we really need to understand how networking really impacts all of that. Luckily, again, the public cloud itself can provide things like virtual circuits, can provide things like isolation and grouping resources in a way that can generate the same experience as if you were kind of putting them behind your firewalls. And there are also both native and third-party implementations of firewalling in a public cloud, from something very general all the way to things that kind of, even on a container basis, that's the things that Aqua does, is to provide you that firewall experience even on a small workload. The next two things in the middle are really about the process and the changes that needs to happen organizationally. The cloud can really accelerate development and rollout, and it's good because we want to be a nimble business. On the other hand, sometimes we move too fast, right? We move too fast. We sometimes move fast and break things, like the famous saying. And the idea is that we need to have the right set of controls at every point. So when we talk about how we can start to solve some of those issues, we need to have those control points, right? So we need to have the ability to stop a particular action, stage them, move from environment to environment so that we have the right security controls in place as we develop our application. And then we come into the two major things that are in the application design phase, and that is that cloud lends itself to use of cloud native technology. Now, cloud native is not necessarily all in the cloud, and cloud is not necessarily all in cloud native, but cloud native is those newer rollouts of applications. That would be your containers, that would be your Kubernetes, that would be functions in the cloud. And they're heavily using both open source components, so that is where the external piece of software that come into your organization. And for the most part, if you are rolling out a version of an AWS service, you really don't control the code, right? There are some quality attributes of the service, and you want to maintain the security settings on that, but it's really not your code. So the public cloud does provide you with options to consume external code, actually as part of its native operations, and we need to make sure that we do that securely. And then something that Peter mentioned in the beginning was regulatory compliance. Again, a good news, bad news type of situation. Because of the self-documenting and self-auditing nature of the cloud, there is a lot of things that just come built in for the regulatory compliance. On the other hand, when we talk about how we provision settings in the cloud, how we provision workloads in the cloud, we just need to be cognizant that some of our choices may impact our compliance posture. And those could be really fundamental choices, as in which region we want to run, right? So if you're a global business and you have privacy regulations in different regions, you want to make sure that your applications are spread, among those regions and have those availability zones concentrated where the data needs to be. And it can also be a situation where the settings themselves might impact your regulatory compliance. So it's not just like things like GDPR and privacy rules, but it's also SOC 2 and other elements of the regulatory compliance, all the way from PCI to GLBA, and some of those setting choices that we have an impact on our compliance posture. So when we talk about compliance posture, we start to talk about solutions, and the solutions that come to mind, and I don't think I'm giving any shocking news to everybody, is around what is known in the industry as CSPM, or Cloud Security Posture Management. The inner workings of a CSPM solution are fairly straightforward. It means that there is a cloud. Let's say you have a region in AWS, or you have an account in AWS, and you have some resources in that cloud. It could be a few VMs, it could be containers, it could be storage, networking, and so on. And all of them can have, from a few to a dozen settings that define what that service is. So think about, the ports that are open. Think about the encryption on the disk. Think about the access to storage and all the identities. And from time to time, the practice is to look at all those settings, compare them to configuration best practices, find the delta, map that to the compliance needs if you need to. And then most CSPM solutions will also give you a fix advice, or even attempt to do the fix themselves. And then you rinse and repeat, right? You always have that cycle. So the classic way to do CSPM, and CSPM is a practice that's been around at least 15 years in some way, shape, or form, and that is providing us with the ability to really check ourselves in every step of the way. However, when we look at the responsibility model that we saw earlier, CSPM for the most part is really around the bottom tier of the customer responsibility, right? So these are all the settings and the way that the cloud is configured. CSPM, up until maybe about a year ago, really didn't bother itself too much with the inner workings of the workload. This was the realm of security for VMs or doing things like operating system compliance and detection and response and so But when we start to look at deployments that are more cloud dependent, and those are shared services like EKS, like the ability to provision functions in the cloud, we find ourselves in the modern realm of CSPM, which is a little bit more complex, because apart from the central line there of scanning the cloud configuration, compliance map, and fix advice, we also need to take a look at two other things. So the two things on the left side would be scanning the infrastructure as code, because in a mature organizations, there is less and less emphasis on going into, let's say, the AWS console and configuring resources. This is all done by code, by using the CLI or API calls into the cloud. And that gives more power to development, and changes happen en masse. So there needs to be some attention brought there. The other thing is the workloads themselves, right? So even if you have the cloud absolutely configured with all the best practices, as if it was your own well-configured data center, but the workload itself has a material weakness, either a vulnerability or there's been an intrusion to that workload, it really could compromise the cloud itself. So we need to bring those two elements here. And then CSPM from there is starting to include things like software vulnerabilities and configuration vulnerabilities of the workloads themselves, what software we put on them, where it's coming from, defending against intrusion, defending against supply chain attacks. We still need to do all our compliance mapping and maybe start to include some of the elements of the workload. And then it's another element that needs to be part of this is that this whole cycle of scanning, comparing, and fixing just takes time. It sometimes takes a number of days at best, or maybe even longer, to really fix an issue in cloud configuration. On the other hand, workloads run in real time, right? If I have a server that is configured with open networking, or too many permissions, or has access to storage that it's not supposed to have, the impact can be immediate. So we also need to monitor not just what is happening as we scan and fix the cloud configuration. We really need to have runtime protection, real-time protection into all those workloads. Now, the reason why CSPM evolved to the way that it evolved is because we need to understand really what is the attack patterns, or what is the risk in running in the cloud. So if you think of your cloud configuration as a bunch of resources, networking, identities, and they are all part of the cloud infrastructure. So to bring a corollary to a data center, that would be your servers, your storage, your NAS. On the networking, that would be your virtual routers and switches and firewalls, and IDs. That would be the people that are able to manage the cloud, which is the people that would have had access to the data center, register and go through the cage in the old days. And a material weakness in any one of those can lead to exposure, right? If we have a misconfigured resource or open network connections, or an ID that is open to everybody, that can create exposure. That exposure in a cloud environment can lead to two things. At the bare minimum, it could lead to just stealing cloud resources, and that is still a problem, where if you have your cloud misconfigured, somebody can run an unauthorized workload. A lot of time, they're not doing it to steal your data. They want to mine for Bitcoin, and they would use cloud resources. But you could have an incident that actually impacts your workload. So CSPM Classic, CSPM 1.0, is designed to prevent that, right? If we handle all the misconfigurations and have our cloud bring to best practices, we are going to reduce our exposure. We are going to reduce the chance of an incident, and then our workloads are going to be safe from manipulation by external hostile actors, because we have the ability to monitor everything that happens in the cloud environment. Now, that said, our workload is not an innocent entity, right? Because workloads, the same as servers in your own on-prem data center, can still have problems. which means that we can still have vulnerabilities. We can still have problems with networking and IDs as it relates to the workload, not necessarily to the routers and switches and firewalls inside of the workload. And that can also create an incident. And understanding that, first of all, to me, that gives me a lot of confidence of moving to the public cloud, because you really are not supposed to be worse off than you are today. And really, the public cloud is not introducing more problems on your workloads. The practice of maintaining secure workloads, if you have them, can translate directly to a cloud environment. So reducing the amount of vulnerabilities, doing good intrusion detection on workloads, configuring good networking and IDs on workloads, which is something that you should really have today, even in your on-prem or co-located dedicated data centers. So any chance of an incident really is not caused by the cloud. It's just the fact that workload might be compromised. That said, though, the combination of workload weaknesses plus cloud misconfigurations, that can be a problem, which means that if we do have an incident coming from the workload and we have misconfigurations in the cloud, that could create a cascading set of exposure that feeds upon itself. So most of the cloud intrusions and problems that we've seen in recent years, and I'm not going to name them, but there have been a few in the financial space, are a result of that. It's a cloud misconfiguration plus a problem in a workload or in the administration, which created that feedback loop where an incident from the workload can exploit misconfiguration, which would then create more incident, and then we have a cascading failure in the cloud environment. So that is what we want to avoid, right? We want to avoid that cascading failure that we can't control, and it has to be done by working at it from both ends. We have to work on the cloud configuration and on the security of the workload. So Peter, without going into any specifics there, but what can you tell us about maybe a kind of a cautionary tale of some place where that cascading failure actually happened?
Well, I would say that the key capabilities that our customers are really focused on in financial services are exactly the kind of things, Tsvi, that you've talked us through, which is really managing the end-to-end security capabilities across their cloud environment, and of course across different in different ways. So there's as you've taken us through, the ability to manage things like drift protection, identify issues where something's running as root, open source checks, clear text passwords, scanning across thousands of containers, and blocking intrusions in real time. I think that there are so many. I guess one of the things that we try to guide our customers through is that the ability to protect your cloud environment is relevant in a lot of contexts, and customers that are thinking about it in a comprehensive fashion and choosing tools that leverage the AWS kind of native capabilities, and Aqua is a great example of a terrific partner in this space that has really had the experience of how do you identify, manage, and proactively prevent vulnerabilities before they even happen, and then also help you protect yourself at runtime. And that comprehensive coverage is what we advise our customers, right? Look at your cloud environment in a way that is comprehensive, and that takes full advantage of the capabilities to really monitor every activity that is happening, which is in many cases step forward from what's been possible in an on-premises data center.
Absolutely. And this all goes into what, as you adopt the public cloud, especially for financial services with a high level of trust that is required, is really a cloud security program. And that means that it needs to be led by security. And security, I think, has the right and actually the obligation to demand that all the processes that we now do in a private data center have parallels and can have the same outcome as in the cloud. And kind of the building blocks of a cloud security program really boil down to identifying the risks. So the risks in cloud configuration, the risk in workload, prioritizing those risks. Not every risk in the cloud is made equal. And we need to understand what is the impact on the business, what is the impact on the customer, right? A slight misconfiguration in maybe the capacity of storage to replicate itself in an application that is not material to the business is probably going to be prioritized less than of course, an active intrusion that happened on the workload, but also even a misconfiguration that can impact an application that is highly sensitive or needs to be highly available. So once we identify the risk, we need to prioritize them. Now, that prioritization task, unfortunately, is where a lot of organizations find difficulty. And there's two reasons for that. One is just the sheer volume of findings, especially when you start with the cloud. There will be a lot of findings, and it takes some time to kind of work through them and make sure that we are working on the right things. And just by the sheer volume of that, we have to make sure that we have the processes in place. Another thing is the expertise, and that is really knowing what is the right configuration. And I think there's been a lot of progress in recent years. The defaults of the cloud deployment and the cloud resources are much more secure than they were even a few years ago. And most of the CSPM solutions today can give you really good detailed remediation advice on how to do that. There is even now starting to see use of generative AI. So if you ask ChatGPT, for instance, I have a workload or I have a storage in Amazon and I need it encrypted, it will tell you exactly what to do. So it is really interesting to see how machines can help us do that prioritization and remediation. And then when we look at how to remediate, this is also a little bit of a maturity progress, right? Because when you start with the public cloud, you'll see what we see is a lot of interactive working with the cloud, working with the AWS console or the CLI, a lot of human involvement. As organizations mature, you're going to see more automation in that and more in infrastructure as code. But regardless of how you do this, if you do this just as the beginning of the way, when you have a lot of misconfigurations where your prioritization is really sort of flat and you remediate things in the console, or if you're a more mature organization where you're identifying risks and prioritize them automatically because you have a lot of applications running and your remediation is done in infrastructure as code, the process is the same process. At the end of the day, what will happen is that you will start with the cloud itself. These configuration standards of AWS are well documented, and we have the ability to find them and do them. But as you progress, as your implementation becomes more mature, we need to start to include the supporting services on both sides. That means that if we look at software supply chain and infrastructure as code in the development pipeline, there's a lot of good that can be done there to prevent those misconfigurations and security risks to even advance to the cloud. And then on the running workloads, the supporting processes around real-time remediation and runtime protection are going to help us to mitigate that backflow into the cloud environment. So as your cloud security program matures, we can kind of look beyond the cloud infrastructure itself, both into the supply chain and then into the DevOps pipeline. And then we start to have a positive feedback loop, right? We saw an earlier negative feedback loop where intrusions can actually cascade in front of the cloud environment. Now we have a positive feedback loop. And that positive feedback loop is that we can scan infrastructure as code beyond deployment. There could be an acceptance gate there so that bad configuration doesn't even make it to the cloud. If we see any misconfigurations in the cloud, we can remediate them back in code. One of the mistakes that organizations do as they mature is they use the top arrow on the left to look for misconfigurations in this code, but they forget the backflow into fixing those misconfigurations. And what happens there is that you identify a problem, you fix it in place, and you think that you fixed it, but then because you didn't really fix the underlying code, when developers or the application rolls out another version, it usually replaces or overwrites those settings in the cloud environment. So that is something that we need to be aware of, that if we're going to do the configuration of the cloud using infrastructure as code, we also need to fix it in infrastructure as code. On the right-hand side, we look for two processes around running workloads. One, running workloads or what the applications are can help us prioritize the configuration events, right? So if we see a misconfiguration and that happens to be attached to a workload where we see some suspicious runtime activity, we need to work together to, between the infrastructure side and the workload side to fix that as soon as possible, and both need to be fixed at the same time. On the other hand, the runtime protection can also mitigate against some cloud misconfigurations, right? Because a lot of times our workload is also our last line of defense. So if our workload is configured properly and it has runtime controls, intrusion prevention, for instance, or in the case of cloud native, drift prevention, which is the ability to see if something was added to a workload outside the deterministic way in which it's supposed to be deployed in cloud native, it can actually help us mitigate as we attempt to fix some of those cloud misconfiguration. So these cycles to funnel both security controls out of the infrastructure as code and funnel them back, and the ability to use runtime protection both as a prioritization aid and as a way to backstop or mitigate against some cloud intrusion is really giving us a lot of benefit, and we can do kind of an upward spiral of reducing risk and elevating security if we do this right and if it's made part of the program. Now, there's a lot of things that we really haven't touched on. This has really been a cursory overview of how to do cloud and securing the cloud. But some other things that we can consider that really are tied all together are things like identities in the cloud, multiple cloud accounts, the use of Kubernetes to deploy software, and Kubernetes itself has it's kind of like a mini cloud inside the cloud. It has a lot of settings and security that we need to think of. We need to think of code security, coding practices. Those are all related. We need to think about the security of the nodes, and if you're using containers, the security of images. And it really is all tied together. But it still goes back to the initial process of making sure that our cloud security program is doing the basic fundamental things. So it doesn't matter if it's an image, it doesn't matter if it's a cluster. We need to identify the risk, we need to prioritize the risk, and we need to remediate it as fast as possible based on the prioritization that we have. And all of that together is going to give us a streamlined cloud security program where everything can be done. And at the end of the day, we are looking for some business outcomes, right? We're moving to the cloud to provide efficiency. And I think those are going to be probably self-explanatory because we can measure that with savings in development time and giving better service. On the other hand, the security ones need to be defined. So we need to reduce time the development spend on security fixes. We're not really paying them to do security work. We're paying them to write the applications. And if they can write the applications securely from the get-go, if they can configure their infrastructure as code initially in a well-formed, bug-free way, then they can just go back and concentrate on the application. Where we find that this is not working is where you start to do a cycle of fixing and it gets overridden because you don't fix in the infrastructure as code, or you just don't do any infrastructure as code scanning at all. And then everything that happens in the cloud that needs to be corrected will involve the developer's time taking in an emergency type of situation, right? Taking them away from the job and then having them work on that. We also want to reduce the exposure throughout the cloud infrastructure and the workloads. That sounds really fundamental, and it is. But without a good, mature cloud security program, we will not be able to do that. There's just too much going on in the cloud, and we also have to compensate for what I talked about initially, which is the lack of expertise. So until you develop those expertise, the security program can actually help with that. And if we do see a problem or something that needs to be fixed, working through those two sides, both at runtime and finding the infrastructure as code that created it and fixing it, is actually going to be faster. Because one of the benefits of doing it through code is that you can change something and deploy it and affect a massive amounts of workloads or massive amount of infrastructure with just one action. So the business benefits are tremendous. And I think, Peter, there are probably other benefits that I didn't even list that have to do with just consumption of the cloud and effect on the business. What other things did you think that I missed on this list?
I mean, I think you touched on all the right things, and the thing that that what systematically incorporating security, as you say, into your development process, a sort of this shift left approach of creating and enabling tools for developers across your organization to be thinking about security as they're building the platforms, and then scanning and identifying risks ahead of deployment is a tremendous enabler really for agility, right? And so agility is the ability to move a lot faster because you are able to systematically not only provision new environments and sort of operate in an unlimited fashion in terms of things like compute or storage, but also because you're able to identify risks before, as you've taken us through, Tsvi, before deployment in many cases, and having that ability to systematically identify risks and then encourage security practices in the process being built in as developers are building the applications. All of a sudden, your organization can move a lot faster. And that's really transformational because when you have incorporated a much more secure way of operating that is so much more efficient, you can try new things a lot more frequently. And that is ultimately one of the biggest kind of surprises that our customers see in the cloud, is that not only are they no longer kind of limited by a finite set of infrastructure, but their organization can ideate more and they can try new things because they're not only unlimited in terms of provisioning, but they're also much more systematic in their ability to deploy. And that goes to some of the key things that I think you've taken us through, Tsvi. So it's really exciting.
All right. So yeah, this is the last slide of the presentation, and luckily we have a few questions in the chat here. So one question that was asked, and I think this is for you, Peter, because it goes back to the fundamentals of the responsibility model, is that when you mention everything is created via API and logged, are you referring to the cloud components? However, underneath there is hardware and associated access that would be limited to AWS engineers. So how to communicate security and compliance with this nugget? So I think the crux of the question is, how does AWS actually secure their own data centers and make sure that nobody from AWS is doing things they shouldn't?
Yeah. So great question. And I think, one of the things foundationally is the even physical controls on our data centers are incredibly robust. Somebody such as myself, who's been at Amazon a long time, doesn't even know where the data centers are, much less would I have access to be allowed in. One of the interesting things that is that I think is a game changer just from a physical security perspective is when you're designing an infrastructure that is used by millions and millions of people, the scale there enables you to afford the most robust processes that I could imagine for protecting who can enter that data center, who can access it, and of course beyond that, things like protection from power outages and all sorts of kind of risks in the world. So I think and then beyond that, sort of at the software and API layer, the ability to provision and access the AWS infrastructure. Of course, we at AWS are not doing any manual effort when a customer is provisioning a new server or storage. That is all a systematic process, and the protection capabilities that are embedded into how AWS makes that available are extremely robust and have been one of the key sort of benefits that customers see. I know, especially in financial services, as they move kind of away from data centers, they're looking at these security protections as another key advantage of moving to the cloud.
Yeah, and I'm sure that there are, you can supply the right documentation and help people pass compliance, when they start to consume those AWS services.
Absolutely.
Right. So we had another question. If we use a lift and shift strategy to get into the cloud, how does that impact security? So for those, that's actually a nice, insightful question. So for those who don't know what lift and shift is the fact that we are transferring our workloads directly, right? Copying the file system of a server from the private data center to an instance, an EC2 instance in the case of a server in AWS. So I'm going back to the slide about the risk, because when we do lift and shift, we take the workload wholesale. So the workload is transferred as is, with all the settings and everything that goes into the file system of the server, including if you already have antivirus deployed on it, it will have it. If you have intrusion detection on it, it will be deployed there. So you are not worse or better off than when you do lift and shift of workloads right into the cloud. So there's really no impact on security, but we of course need to be sure that is secure. On the other hand, when we do provision that EC2 instances, before we copy the file system, we will provision the cloud supporting cloud services. So that would be the identities, the resources, the storage that workload is going to have access to. And that is where I would put most of my effort. So if you're doing a lift and shift strategy, if you're taking, let's say, create a account in AWS and start to move servers, and you think that your security on the servers is pretty good and you have the right tooling in place, you can just leave them as is. And I would spend most of my time on those surrounding configurations, on the storage and on the networking and on the identities in the cloud, and making sure that my CSPM 1.0, the initial process of cloud security, is going to be covered, and then that is going to provide that security. At the end of the day, once we do that, once we lift and shift, I would say that we still need to review the settings on the workload and then start to put them into the process of real-time CSPM, so that we can have a complete system that will take care of both sides. But when you're doing lift and shift, if you're confident with the security of your servers, you can actually just transfer them as is. And we have just one more question on the chat there, which is, which department is responsible for fixing those security problems in the cloud? And that is ultimately security, right? Ultimately, security is in charge of everything. But if we have a big intrusion in the cloud, it's really the CISO office that is going to get the call. And that's why security needs to do two things, right? We need to support the effort to move into cloud because the business is going to demand it. You can't really resist it. If you don't do that, you get into a shadow IT situation, right? So we've learned that before, in the hard way, before we kind of, as security, adopted the cloud. So we can't really bury our head in the sand. We need to be responsible for that. What we can do is we can provide that cloud security program, and that cloud security program should provide the incentive for developers, everybody that has to do infrastructure as code and develop the applications, to do that securely. And we also need to provide that tool set. So the Aqua tool sets that actually is the driver for the cloud security program is usually owned by security, and it gives several services: remediation services, scanning services, result services, metrics, risk over time. All these things are provided as part of the Aqua platform to make sure that it's being used. But ultimately, we're dealing with security. And we just had one question: is what is the really easiest way to get started on AWS if you really have no cloud experience? So Peter, what would you say about that?
I think what we encourage customers to do, and it's, if you think about some of these large enterprises that are getting started, and some are very advanced, others are sort of very early days. It's interesting to see the disparity. But as they're getting started, we recommend trying to focus on specific business value add workloads, and not making a mistake of moving something with a low priority. We've seen that, where a customer will say, look, let me experiment with something that if it fails, it doesn't matter. What we find is they never get it done. And so you have to have something that's really important to your organization in order to get the support that across your organization will be needed. And then, of course, there's the core capabilities and technology expertise that customers usually get. We have AWS training. A lot of times there are, so there's certainly AWS certifications. And so we encourage customers to get a baseline of AWS technical certifications within their teams as they're getting started.
All right. And if you want to know how to get started with the cloud security program, you can always reach out to Aqua, and you can use the resources. There's a handout section that you can find those resources. So I don't see any more questions. So we're getting close to the top of the hour. So Cody, let's close this out.
Awesome. Well, Tsvi and Peter, thank you both so much for providing so much insight this past hour. So much information packed into such a couple slides. So thank you so much for all the thought and time that went into putting together this presentation, guys. I do want to,
thank you.
Of course, I do want to make one call out. I'm about to post a link in the chat. If you wouldn't mind just clicking on that so you can get a quick access to our post-webinar survey. We'd love to hear your thoughts, whether it's about this presentation today, or of course, if you have any suggestions for upcoming topics, we would love to hear your thoughts. But to kind of cover some other things, just a reminder that our session today was recorded. Should you want to rewatch, you will be receiving an email with a link to access the recording on demand. And you can also find the recording living on the Cloud Native Now website at cloudnativenow.com/webinars. And be sure to look in the on-demand section. I'd like to thank AWS and Aqua Security for sponsoring our program today. And I do still have 4 Amazon gift cards to give away. So our winners are Luke Z, Antonio R, Waleed S, and Harry L. So to our 4 winners, congratulations. Keep an eye on your inbox to claim your gift card. We'll reach out to you in the next 48 hours or so to let you know how to get that. If you don't happen to see that email, check your spam folder on the off chance that you happen to get filtered out. So I've already made a call out to our survey. So if you just hang out with us for one more moment, you'll be filtered straight there. Otherwise, we do hope to see everyone at a future Techstrong learning experience. Have a great rest of your day, and you may now disconnect. Tsvi, Peter, thanks again.